If you're thinking about going on insurance panels or accepting insurance in your private practice, or maybe you've already on some insurance panels and you're finding that the whole process is difficult and cumbersome to manage, there is a solution, and that solution is Practice Solutions. Practice Solutions is specifically for mental health providers, and they are the insurance billing and credentialing experts. So I'd invite you to go over and take a look at the things that Practice Solution has going on. Jeremy and his whole team are dedicated to helping those of us in private practice be successful and really navigate that whole cumbersome process of being on insurance panels. So go over to practiceoftherapy.com/practice solutions and check out Practice Solutions today. This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. This is session number 53 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, folks. I'm Gordon Brewer, and I'm so glad you've joined me for this episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Today is going to be a little bit of a change for me in that the person I'm interviewing is not actually in our field. But we're going to be talking about something that I think is very important and sometimes just very intimidating for people in our private practices, and that is the whole financial side of private practice and knowing how to manage our money and keep our books and tax laws and all those kinds of things that for most of us, our eyes just kind of glaze over when we have to think about those things. Or as my daughter used to say, that just makes my head hurt. So anyway, we're going to get to that in a minute. But one of the things that I just wanted to be sure you know about and would invite you to kind of take a look at is I am putting together, and this interview is kind of a precursor to this, putting together a course for people in private practice on the whole financial side of things. And I've put together a survey. It's a very short survey. I promise it will only take you 3 minutes or less to fill out the survey. But I want to get your feedback on what your needs are just around this whole topic of private practice finance and the financial side of our businesses. So if you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com /finance survey. I've got to create that link, but that'll be it. Practiceoftherapy.com /finance survey. And that'll take you to the page that will get you to that survey. It's just a Google form that you'll fill out and just answer a few questions for me so that I can begin to get some feedback around this whole topic and making sure that I'm doing what people are looking for. So if you'll do that, I would greatly appreciate it. The other thing too is if you're listening to this podcast, wherever you might be listening to it, I'd invite you to go over and subscribe to it. Especially on iTunes or in Google Play or Stitcher or Spotify, wherever you might listen to it, subscribe to the podcast. That just kind of helps boost our ratings and makes the podcast easier for people to find. And also, I would really appreciate it if you would leave a review for the podcast and give me your honest feedback. Give it a rating and all of that good stuff. And that, again, just helps boost what we're doing here and trying to grow the practice of therapy and really trying to help you grow your private practices. I'm just very passionate about this whole work and what you all do out there that might be listening to this. I've said all along that those of us that are in this field, this whole mental health provider field, whether you're a therapist, a counselor, or a social worker, or psychologist, we do noble work, and people come to us day in and day out, and they share with us the most intimate details of their lives and the things that they're struggling with. And sometimes that's just kind of hard to carry because I know I know for me, there are a lot of times when I just think about my clients and think about what they're going through and how I can best be of help to them. And one of the things that I don't need to be worrying about is how to run the business side of my business. That should just all take care of itself and just kind of run on its own. And being under financial strain and being under the pressure and stress of that, in addition to the work that we do with our clients, is just something that's not necessary for us. And so as you're hearing from me, there's kind of a theme here going on around the whole financial side of private practice. And that is the main reason that I wanted to have the guest that I've got today. One of my friends in the community, his name's Billy Robinson, and he's a certified public accountant. And so that's what he does for a living. He's a professional. And so I wanted to get somebody like him on the podcast to really talk about this whole financial side of things and really kind of give those of you that are listening some basics. Some of this you might know already if you've been doing this a while. Hopefully you got your own accountant. If you do not, I would really encourage you to get an accountant, somebody local to you that knows your state laws and state requirements around filing taxes and all that sort of thing, because there's so many times I worry about folks. They get themselves into trouble because they don't know about how self-employment is different than just being employed by a company or by an agency somewhere. And the tax implications are so much different. And there's this whole thing called self-employment tax that we have to pay. And you should be paying that quarterly. If you're not, again, talk to an accountant about that, because you could get yourself in deep trouble and just really become very expensive for you just financially if you're not paying those quarterly taxes or making some sort of provision around paying your taxes every year as a self-employed person in private practice. So anyway, didn't mean to get on a soapbox there about that, but I think it's so important that we not only take care of ourselves physically, emotionally, and spiritually, but also financially. And that's one of the biggest stressors that most people have, not only in our business, but just in our clients. I hear it from our clients all the time that they're just struggling financially, and it doesn't have to be that way. So anyway, without further ado, here is a certified public accountant and my friend, Billy Robinson. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Practice of Therapy podcast. This is Gordon Brewer, and I'm so happy to have with me today my friend Billy Robinson, who is a CPA and works in the community I live in. And Billy, so glad to have you with me.
I'm glad to be here, Gordon. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes. So, Billy, tell folks a little bit about yourself. I mean, this is a little different interview for me. Usually, got these clinicians and counselor types that are on here. And so I was just so happy that you agreed to be on the podcast and, giving your expertise just around the whole business finance piece that
Sure.
a lot of people are intimidated by. Tell folks a little bit about your story.
So my name is Billy Robinson, and I'm a CPA with Brown Edwards and Company. We are a regional firm with offices in Virginia, West Virginia, and Tennessee. And most of our offices are in smaller communities where we have a lot of small business clients. We deal with a lot of healthcare practitioners, deal with a lot of doctors, counselors, et cetera. So have a wide range of experience in both accounting and assurance work and tax work and just general consultations for businesses. So been very blessed to live here in the same community as Gordon. And so it's just a great opportunity to be here. And I hope that I hope that I will exceed expectations and not bore everybody to death.
Yeah. And I think, I know when talking with people, just other counselors and therapists that particularly people that listen to the podcast, when we get into the financial side of things, I think sometimes people's eyes just kind of glaze over and they get worried and that sort of thing. But as we talked about, before we started recording, I think maybe a place to start would be, let's just talk about some basics around business finance. And I know there's just so much that people probably want to know and need to know around
Sure.
that whole topic. So if somebody's getting started, what are some of the first things they need to do?
Well, some of the first things, Gordon, I tell folks when people come in, and meet with us and, they're interested in starting a business, et cetera. Oftentimes they're experts in the field that they're in, but they're not experts in legal matters or accounting matters. And so a lot of people try to make do. And I think one of the quickest and most important things is to recognize that, professional assistance, just like counselors provide, is important. So seeking out a good CPA, seeking out a good attorney who can advise you on these matters, just somebody that, trusted advisors is very important. And not everyone needs, there are some good practitioners out there that are not CPAs, but, a CPA is you have to take a pretty comprehensive test and have a good knowledge base. So I think, first of all, you want to find some trusted advisors. Second of all, I think you want to familiarize yourself with how owning and operating your own business is going to be different than how it has been if you have been an employee for another company, because as you well know, it's different. There's a whole new set of responsibilities and things that you have to pay attention to. For example, if you're going to have employees, you're going to have to set up payroll taxes, and you're going to have to determine how often you pay payroll taxes, and it depends on what the size of your payroll is, and whether or not you're going to have other people in your organization. Are they going to be employees, or are they going to be independent contractors? And knowing the filing requirements for that is important. Probably the most important decision that someone can make from the very beginning is probably a choice of entity that you're going to use to file your income tax returns. One of the things that we see oftentimes with self-employed individuals is they start the business and they start the counseling or start, whatever it is, the activity that they're doing, and they don't necessarily understand how it's different from being an employee. And so choices of the entity is very important. For a lot of small businesses, a lot of people do not necessarily set up a separate, corporation or anything. They just do it and report everything on Schedule C. And we have lots of clients who use Schedule C presentation, and that's understandable. And I'm not here to give legal advice at all. But one thing to keep in mind is when you are a Schedule C, if you've not set up in a lot of states, you have what's called like LLCs or corporations. You probably do not have as much a legal liability protection that some of these organizations provide. Each state law is different, so it really depends on the state that you're in. So that's why it's important to find somebody who's familiar with your state laws. But the choice of entity is important. And what a lot of people don't realize is actually, a lot of people don't want to file a separate tax return for an entity. It's going to be two tax return fees, one for your personal and one for an entity. Is that in a lot of states, or in the IRS, if it is a single member LLC, so if you set up a single member LLC in your state, if those are allowed, which is a limited liability corporation, the IRS actually disregards that entity for taxation purposes, and it's still reported on your Schedule C. So it's reported on your personal return, but you get some level of legal liability protection. Right. So that is an important component. Some organizations set up what's called C Corps or S Corps. I don't usually find that with smaller entities and organizations, and the tax regime for that is somewhat more complicated. But it can fit very well if you have multiple people in practice together, or you're kind of in business with other people, and you want ultimate liability protection from each other, for claims from each other, et cetera. So I think choice of entity is very important, as just kind of one starting point. Right.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that, in consulting with other therapists that I really encourage them to do is, like you said at the beginning there, is talk with an expert, somebody that's a professional in those things, and also just creating that entity. And I think, one of the things too that I've run into with people, and you might want to talk to this, is that understanding the importance of keeping their business finances separate from their personal finances. You want to talk a little bit about that, Billy? Yeah.
I do. You never want to be the shoebox client, okay? The shoebox client gets charged a lot of money and might even get you fired from some CPAs. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is you don't want to be the person who brings in all your information in a shoebox or in a bag and say, here you go, figure it out. You really do need to have a type of accounting system that you can account for your business expenses separately from your personal finances. You probably should have a separate business credit card. You really shouldn't. For complexity's sake, it's probably not beneficial to have the same accounts for both personal use and business use. And the IRS, if you're ever audited, one of the first things they start looking at is for personal expenses that have been expensed through the company. Right. To qualify as an expense, it has to be a necessary and ordinary expense for the business itself. So, a lot of people tend to, they may run gas or those kinds of things through. And, if you're not able to substantiate that as a business expense and you're audited, then you're likely going to be have some challenges. So I think a good accounting system for most small businesses, quite frankly, I think QuickBooks is the best system out there for small businesses. Mm-hmm. It's very user friendly. They have a new system called QuickBooks Online. That is, you don't have to buy software; it's in the cloud, and it gives you good ability to bill and that kind of thing. And most organizations, and I would say counseling as well. There may even be some specialty software out there for counselors specifically that might have a billing component, an appointment tracking component, and also maybe some general ledger capabilities built in. Because you really do want to keep track. So I would suggest setting up your own checking account, your own credit card statement for the business, and keeping that information separate. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is there are things that prior to when you were an employee of an organization may not have been deductible on your return or not as tax advantageous. But when you start your own business, they do. Startup expenses, that you have to start your business, that information can be those amounts can be accumulated, and under certain provisions, you can write that amount off in the first year. Sometimes you may have to capitalize that, but you get a really expense, some startup expenses there. Travel, that's a common thing. People oftentimes ask, well, can I buy a car in the company? And the answer is yes, you can, but you have to also account for your personal usage of that. And so keeping mileage logs is very important if you travel for your business. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that even if you use your own personal car, you're able to deduct your mileage. I believe the rate this year is 53 cents a mile for use of your personal car. But keeping those mileage logs are critical, and recording where you're going and where you're coming from and the purpose of the meeting. Just a simple mileage log in your car is important. So those are all, pretty important parts. And there's other advertising expenses, certifications that you may have to pay, that maybe you had to pay for personally prior to, or organizations that you're a member of, training, conferences, things that possibly before you paid out of pocket if you were an employee. Those things are all necessary and ordinary business expense to support you in your practice.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I've learned is just to try, which we know this on the clinical side of things for those of us in this field, is to document everything. But the same thing is true on the financial side as far as understanding that. One of the things that in my previous podcast, I think I shared with this with you at one time, Billy, but we had Mike Michalowicz, who is the author of Profit First. And one of the things that, he talks a lot about, he's got a kind of an unconventional way of doing accounting, which I like. It makes sense to me just as a non accounting person. But one of the things that he talks about, though, is being able to have reports and things like that. And you mentioned QuickBooks, and that's one of the things that I've learned that is so important to really kind of keep a pulse on how well my business is doing is by looking at those reports. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think one of the things, there's the old joke. I don't know how I bounced a check. I wasn't out of checks in my checkbook. So, I mean, it's kind of, talk a little bit about how people can, in their businesses, making sure that they're profitable and why that's important.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, to be a counselor in the field of counseling, obviously you're out there to help individuals. And that's primarily the reason that people get into counseling. They don't, oftentimes it's not a money-making provision.
Right, exactly.
Provide support. But at the same time, you want to be able to provide for yourself and for your family. And if you're a good counselor with a good client base and want to grow, the way I look at it is that if that is your wish and that's your desire, the better you run your business, the more people you're going to be able to help. Right. The more you're going to be able to grow, the more managed you're going to be. And so there's nothing wrong with making sure that you're keeping track of things. And you're exactly right. I mean, probably the most important thing that I think people don't pay attention to is cash flow. Yeah. And that is the crux of any business enterprise. It is absolutely no fun to be working yourself to death and feel broke all the time. That's not a fun. So, you want to maintain, in my opinion, good practices are you want to set aside a reserve, an emergency fund, so to speak. You are self-employed. So if something happens to you and you get sick, you want to have a source of funds because you're not going to be able to see patients for a while, or for some reason you weren't able to see patients for a while. So having an emergency fund is good both in your personal and professional world and for your business. I think a lot of folks, they, especially if you bill insurance, et cetera, where I see a lot of practitioners not really pay a lot of attention is they'll bill the insurance and then not really do good on following up and collections. And dealing with insurance today is very difficult, very complex. Right. Most organizations, I think, a lot of people use external billers that do the billing for them. Which I fully support because the way I look at counseling specifically is it's kind of like a CPA. You only have so many hours in the day, and depending on what it is that you're doing, are you spending your time on the business, or are you spending your time in the business? And spending your time on the business is the most important thing, not spending your time in the business. And so billing and accounting and those kinds of things, of course, as you're building your practice, that's probably necessary that you keep your overhead expenses low. But at some point, you have to realize that this time that you're using for those type of activities may very well be taking you away from probably the most important thing for your business, which is revenue generation, which is generally you, unless you have other employees that are working for you and you're managing them. So managing your time is just critical. Time and cash flow for anybody that's in a service-oriented business, just like me, managing my time is critical. Managing our employees' time is critical. Right. So I think that's really important. And if you don't, and what I tell folks is if you're not tracking it, how do you know? Right. There's times in which cash flow is going to go up and cash flow is going to go down. There are times, I suspect, in your business that sometimes you're busier than others. Maybe the summer is not as active, and so you have to prepare for those slower time periods. Maybe the winter is not as active, and you have to prepare for those slower time periods. And so you got to know how your cash flow is going to come in those time frames. Another mistake I often see people make when they go from being employed to self-employed is not understanding the way taxes have changed for them.
Yes.
When you're an employee, you get withholdings taken out of your check each pay period, and somebody sends that to the IRS for you. And at the end of the year, you file your W-2, and hopefully you have enough withholding to cover your taxes, and maybe you get a little refund. When you're in business for yourself, that doesn't happen. Nobody sends any money to the IRS for you, but they don't really go away. So it's important that you remember them in this time.
Yep.
So you have to get used to, a lot of people have to pay quarterly estimates that are, if you're self-employed, you have to set up quarterly estimates. And so every quarter you have to pay generally a substantial amount of money. And if you're not paying that amount, at the end of the year, two things. One, you're going to have a big cash when you file your tax return. You're going to have a big surprise. And two, you're going to get hit with some penalties and interest for underpayment if you've not paid your tax liability. So I often see that when people start their business as a problem.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a conversation I've had with several people. You got to do those quarterly taxes and self-employment taxes. And it's different, like you said, in that it's a little more. You want to talk a little bit about that, and that's also often a surprise?
It is. The biggest surprise, normally income taxes, is, as you're starting up your practice, okay, maybe your income tax expense is not as significant, because you're just growing, et cetera. And so, luckily we have graduated tax rates. And so the lower tax bracket you're in, the less taxes that you pay, except when it comes to a little known thing called self-employment taxes, which you are. You are self-employed if you're a counselor, and that's a critical term. When you were an employee, they took out of your paycheck what was called FICA, or Social Security and Medicare taxes, which was 7.65%. Well, guess what? When you're self-employed, you get to pay that 7.65% plus the employer's 7.65% that they have been paying for you. So that's 15.2% of your self-employment income. Now that's net of expenses, ordinary necessary business expenses. But it is often what people miss and don't realize that, when you're self-employed, you're automatically making, about 7.65% less. And that 7.65 goes all the way up to a little over $120,000, and then it lowers to Medicare tax amounts. But that is oftentimes people get I shouldn't owe much taxes. And when they get their tax bill or their tax return, it's a big surprise.
Right.
And it's hard because if you don't pay those taxes quarterly when you start, the problem that you have is when you file your tax return on April 15th, you're going to owe a big amount. Well, guess what? Your first quarterly estimate's also due on what date? April 15th.
Yep.
And then another one on June 15th, and another on September 15th, and another on January 15th. And so, it's one of those things where you can have a really, really big cash flow gap. And if you spent that money through the winter because you had slower months or whatever, you're gonna have an issue with the IRS. And one thing they really don't like is when you don't pay them what they know that they are owed.
Right.
So it's very critical that you keep track of it.
Right. Yeah. And so, folks, be sure and listen to that, because it's, fortunately I've, had the foresight with that. And so I've not gotten dinged, but I've heard so many stories about people, really owing a substantial amount, like $10,000. How does that sound? Because you write a check for $10,000 if you needed to. And I think the other thing too that I think that I've learned really the importance of, Billy, is allocating as you go.
Yes.
Of being able to, one idea is just to set up a separate checking account or savings account, and that's what you pay a certain percentage to every month towards your taxes. And so when you go to pay your quarterly taxes, you don't feel this big ding of of having to pay those.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to look at, I agree with you, setting that money aside as you have it and as you make it is absolutely critical. And, for most folks, I guess my recommended percentage, if you're just starting out, would probably be about 35%. And if you're growing and being very successful, maybe even as much as 40%. Because you have to remember you have the 15.2% of self-employment taxes. Then you have, the lowest tax rate we have is about 15%. But it goes up pretty quickly from there. So most middle income folks are going to be probably in the 20 to 30% range in terms of their income tax rate. And then on top of that, whatever state you're in may also have an income tax rate. Now, we are blessed to live here in Tennessee where there is no income tax, but there is a hefty sales tax.
Yeah.
But I lived in Virginia for 15 years and in Virginia, or actually all of my life up until recently, moved to Tennessee. And this tax rate there is 6%. And so, you add those amounts up and they add up quickly. And so if you're not setting and everybody will say, well, gosh, that sounds like a lot of money. And all I can say is, yep, it is.
It is. It is. Yeah. Well, this is, and what I really like, Billy, is that you're really kind of validating kind of some things I've said before on previous podcasts, just about the importance of just being prepared, especially having that buffer, so quickly setting up a buffer for your practice in terms of having that money set aside for those slow times. If you need to take time off, being self-employed, you don't get vacation pay. And so you've got to build that in and making sure that you've got, those income sources coming in with that. So, wow. Yeah.
The other thing I'll mention that I think business, as you start out, a lot of people probably don't pay as much attention to is their overhead expenses. Overhead erodes profit quickly. And so, depending on, one of the things that I think anybody in a service business should do is figure out how much they are, quote unquote, able to bill per chargeable hour, right? Because not all of your time can be chargeable to a patient, and so you have to figure out how many hours of chargeable time you're going to have or billable time to patients. And then you're going to have to start kind of backing off how much of that you need to really set a budget from the beginning. What's reasonable the first year? What's reasonable the second year? What kind of overhead can I afford? Is there any way that I can keeping your overhead low at first is very, very, very important.
Right.
And so not spending a lot, making sure you're not spending tons on office space, not necessarily going out and hiring more employees than you need initially is important. So I just think those are just critical aspects that people think that I built it and now they will come. And that is, if you're a good counselor, I'm sure that's true in time.
Right.
But it's really important that you just, you walk slowly and smartly.
Right. Right. To jump to something maybe a little more advanced, one of the things that is people will hear from me and from others is just thinking about your KPIs, your key performance indicators. What have you found are some of those for people in service businesses like counseling and therapy?
Well, I think the key there is you really do have to know how much you're realizing per hour. And I think billing structures, you have to be mindful of your billing structure. You want to be accessible to all patients, but you want to be fair. And one of the things that I've seen counselors do is, the sliding scale method depending on income level. And I think that works very well. And I think that is a good opportunity to kind of make sure your services, and you want to make sure that you're serving all needs. But there's nothing wrong with making sure that you have some clients that can pay your full freight. and that helps you be better in business. It allows you to be, beneficial with your time. And so, so I think build rate per hour is important. I think your overhead expenses as a percentage of your revenue is important. Understanding what your overhead is and whether that's growing or shrinking over time. As you're growing, there may be certain points where you need to invest in overhead, and it really is an investment where you may take less money for a period of time. So I think that's critical. And then and I really think just understanding the cash flow of your business. And, just because if you bill, if you're billing insurance specifically, how long is it going to take you to get a reimbursement? What is the rates in which they're cutting your fee? Understanding what you build versus what the negotiated contract rate is, and understanding what that amount is. So I think it really all revolves around what I'll call the billable hour.
Right. Yeah, and I know that that's something that I think for those of you listening that is important to understand, is especially for those of us that are on insurance panels. For all of us, probably our rate varies from insurance company to insurance company. And so you really want to look at which insurance companies are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, or the biggest bang for your time, rather, and knowing what that is. And then really figuring out what is your average not cost, but average revenue per session. And even breaking that down, like you said, Billy, about the overhead costs, of really understanding what it costs you per client, and breaking it down like that. And I'll try to include in the show notes here just maybe some examples of that, at least how I figure it. Any tips on that about just for people trying to calculate those things? You're looking at your overhead and your billables and all of that.
I think the first thing is you got to be realistic with how much time you're going to have, starting out. Be realistic about the number of patients you're going to have, and just know that if you're just starting out, that's going to take time. And then there's likely going to be a point in time where you're going to have to be more selective with the patients that you take in. You can probably only take in so many insurance patients at a low rate. You can only take in so many patients at a low income scale. And so as your business grows, as your book of appointments gets more filled, I think you just want to make sure that you're and then factoring in your right. Like you have to factor in, how much do I need to set aside for taxes? How much, based on those estimated hours and that estimated, billable rate that I'm going to get for that, how much of that quote unquote dollar needs to be set aside, or percentage needs to be set aside for my rent? How much needs to be set aside for taxes, like we talked about, utilities, just overall, software if you need it for tracking. Those kinds of things are very important. And I think you're right. Just kind of knowing for every dollar that you earn, how much of it needs to go to specific expenses. And being self-employed can be very rewarding. You can be in control of your own schedule. You can be in control of your life. And so you want to make sure that you're not, the other recommendation I'll give you, and I think a lot of service professionals probably mistakenly do, is they run in, deep first and try to get as many appointments as they can, and they don't take time for themselves. Right. And I've been guilty of that myself. And Absolutely. So you got to factor some time for, you said, plan on vacation time. Plan on some time to be healthy for yourself. Because I assume, like most businesses, the healthier you are, the better you're going to be for your patients.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's, you're talking my talk, Billy. I was just trying to think. I was going to say, as we say here in the South, that'll preach. Yeah. Yeah. So, that's perfect. That's perfect. Well, Well, Billy, I want to be respectful of your time, and this has just been one of the greatest interviews, at least in kind of following a theme I've been on here lately of just thinking about what it means to have a lifestyle that is sustainable and having a practice that sustains your lifestyle. And
Absolutely.
And just the other thing too is just making sure that people are taking care of themselves, not only like you mentioned, the health side of things, spiritually, emotionally, and financially, because that's one of the biggest stressors that any of us has just in running a private practice, and just making sure that we're financially stable, financially sustainable with what we do. So thanks so much for being here with this and taking the time to do this. So tell folks, Billy, if they want to get in touch with you or want to reach out to you with questions or whatever, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. You can reach me at my office. Our website is www.becpas.com. My phone number is 423-246-6102. And you can always email me with questions. My email address is brobinson, that's BROBINSON @becpas.com. And so Gordon, thank you for your time. And yes, if there's anybody who has questions about anything, I'd be happy to give a little information.
Sure. And I'll include that information in the show notes so folks can find you there. Well, Billy, again, thank you so much. And I am so glad you did this with me. And I'm sure I'm going to have more questions in the future. And I know we'll be talking again soon.
Sounds good, Gordon. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great weekend.
You too. Well, folks, I hope that this has been a helpful episode for you. I know I'm just so grateful to Billy for coming onto the podcast and just sharing his expertise and just really kind of letting us know how to think about the financial side of private practice and all that involves and all that can be kind of intimidating for us. And I know hopefully it's given you some food for thought and some ideas about some things maybe to do with your practice in terms of how you manage your money and how you take care of things on that side of things. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, there's nothing more heartbreaking than for somebody to be in this business and be in this field and really pouring their heart out to their clients and working really hard to help people and it not be financially viable for them. And so I think by learning all those things and a lot of the things that Billy talked about today, and particularly cash flow, I know that's been something that's been more and more on my radar here of late, of just really paying attention to how the revenue comes in and how I'm spending it and what I pay myself and the profit that I make and all those things are just important to keep your eye on. So again, thanks for joining me in this episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Do check out those resources I mentioned. Go over to practiceoftherapy.com/practice solutions. Those are great folks, and I would really encourage you to get to know Jeremy and learn more about what they have to offer in terms of the insurance billing piece and collections and all of that sort of thing, insurance credentialing, if your practice is ready for that part of it. And also be sure to take part in the survey that I'm doing just around this whole financial management course. Again, this episode was kind of a precursor to that and really something that I really feel kind of drawn to work on and share with people and put some resources together around that whole money management piece of private practice. So again, you can find that at practiceoftherapy.com/finance survey, and that'll get you to the page that's got the Google form that you can fill out for me. Promise you it won't take you long because if you're like me, I don't like doing just really long surveys, and I intentionally made this one just kind of short and sweet and to the point, and you can get in there and take that survey and give it out. And it's an anonymous survey too. I didn't feel like finance is a personal thing, so don't feel like if you answer that, I'm going to know who you are, what you're doing. It's an anonymous survey. So if you'll answer those questions, and that gets me to know what people need and what people want in terms of resources. So take care, folks. Glad you joined me. Do subscribe to the podcast and listen in next week. Got another great episode coming up with my friend Katie Englert, and we're going to be talking about one of the resources that she's put together called Practicat, and you'll learn more about that then. Take care, folks. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. If you haven't already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.